much.
All right, sounds great. Well, welcome everyone to the March 7th meeting of the Climate Action and Accounting Special Interest Group. Excited to have some special guests with us today, which I'll be introducing. First, I want to kick off with just a couple of housekeeping things. For anybody who's on the call for the first time, I want to share that the Linux Foundation follows an antitrust policy, which you might want to familiarize yourself with, especially if you get involved in some of our development work. We also follow a Hyperledger code of conduct, so please do familiarize yourself with that. I typically kick off each call by inviting anybody who is attending for the first time to introduce themselves. So if there's anybody on the call who's on for the first time, please introduce yourself. Share maybe a little bit about how you learned about us and a little bit about your background really quickly. Is there anybody who's new to the call today? You can just raise your hand or speak up. Daniel. Yeah, please.
New to the call, but I'm sure that everyone's going to be hearing from me for at least half this time. So thanks everyone for joining. My name is Dan Norkin.
Yep. Thank you, Daniel. Wes is actually a member. You reminded me of Climate Action Accounting SIG, and this is actually his second presentation. So we'll let him introduce himself in a moment. For everybody else, since we don't really have any other I'll just share real quickly. If you are interested in contributing, on the meeting page, we have links to how to contribute. We have both non-technical contribution opportunities involving outreach, research, and some other roles, as well as development roles. If you're interested in that, I would recommend joining our peer programming calls, which happen every other Monday at 9 a.m. PST. And so I believe the next one is occurring this coming Monday. With regards to working group updates, not a tremendous. I will share for the carbon accounting working group. We are in the conversation of. We're conducting a techno-economic analysis with an energy provider in the MENA region. There is part of that may be focused on using some of the prototypes that we've developed for kind of capturing and tracking carbon emissions using blockchain as kind of as a prototype there. So more to share on that in the future as that project unfolds. With regards to the standards or the research working group, is there anybody who would like to provide any updates? Now is your time, just quickly before we kind of hop into the presentation.
Hi, Sherwood. It's Alex here.
Hey, Alex.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes. How are you?
All right, cool. Sorry, I think good. And yourself?
Good.
Just a quick update. We are working on submitting a project proposal for the mentorship program. So, yeah, that's something coming up. And anybody who's interested in actually have ideas about how we can go about this, or what things the standards working group should pursue as a project, they're welcome to contribute their thoughts. Otherwise, yeah, that's what we'll be doing next week.
Will you remind them really quickly when the standards working group calls are?
This exact time slot, but every other week.
Every other week, that's right. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alex. Yeah, with that, I kind of just want to hop into this because we have a lot to cover today. We have Wes Geisenberger, who joined us in October of 2021, back when he was working with Hedera Hashgraph. Or focused on Hedera Hashgraph. He still is, but now he's helping lead the HBAR Foundation. I met Wes in person when I was at COP27, and I've been really impressed with the ecosystem that he's building. In that environment, what I saw was a lot of corporations and a lot of financial institutions and investors not really complaining, but pointing out the real challenge of kind of deploying assets to decarbonize our global production infrastructure. And the challenges that they were describing were data challenges primarily. Lack of accessibility to critical climate to data, trust in that data, and the cost of generating that data. And so within the HBAR ecosystem, where they're kind of actively been providing grants and funding and expertise and kind of support to different projects, I've been really kind of impressed with the pain points that they're solving in this kind of larger ecosystem of kind of helping unlock resources to kind of move into support the decarbonization of our production and consumption activities. Also happy to have Daniel Norkin here, who is spearheading one of what I think the more interesting technologies within this ecosystem. Guardian is, as he will share, it's about data provenance and this need to provide transparency into where the data, the history of the data, where it's coming from when we're measuring, reporting, and verifying, which is kind of foundational, as everybody knows, to this larger issue of kind of collaboration and resource deployment. So with that, I think I will hand it over to you, Wes and Daniel. Wes, I think you're kicking it off, and happy to allow you to share your screen if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sherwood, thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here. The last time we spoke was actually the week that we open sourced the Guardian and made it available publicly for the first time. So we always think of coming to the Climate Action and Accounting SIG with very fond memories, and we love working with the participants of the SIG, and really appreciate all the great work the Hyperledger Foundation does with a focus on climate accounting, and we're excited how we can work together going forward. If it's okay, I'll go ahead and share the screen.
Sure. Do I need to stop sharing mine first?
Yep.
There we go.
Perfect. And let me know if y'all can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. And so today we're going to talk about building those auditable and efficient sustainability markets on Hedera. And just to give a little further background, and sure, that was a fantastic introduction. I feel like you've done it all the justice in the world. But the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund is a grant-giving organization that is focused on bringing the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger. And we do that on Hedera. We are very much focused on enabling public goods that are reusable, that make it easier to solve for the toughest climate challenges we have today. And so you oftentimes hear about our open source infrastructure like the Guardian, which makes it easier to build a digital measurement, reporting, and verification methodology than any other platform in the world. We believe that you can take a process that sometimes costs hundreds of thousands of dollars and shrink it to a few weeks, with a few resources and an understanding of the MRV process that you want to enable. We have other open source capabilities like the automated regression market maker, which I think may be something that our ecosystem may share in these meetings coming up, focused on understanding the audit trails and the provenance to actually assign price points based on the attributes of every single asset created. So you can imagine something very similar to Zillow, where you want to know an attribute of an ecological asset, whether it's a carbon credit or whether it's a biodiversity credit, a conservation asset, and wanting to know all the attributes, the provenance of where they come from, and saying, I care about these 10 attributes because that's my indicators of quality, and I want to assign a price. Of course, you can't do that without digital measurement, reporting, and verification with those granular attributes. And so we're focused on enabling these public goods so folks can build world-changing applications that help address the climate crisis at scale. And that's really what our fund's about. And it's bringing the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger in an auditable, data and information discoverable, and liquid way. What that means is we know the rules that we're accounting with. We know the actors who fulfill different roles within those rule sets in a measurement, reporting, and verification process. We know the data that they produce, and it's not just data, it's actually information that we can read, not just machine readable, but human readable. And ultimately those attributes that are derived from it where assets are meant to be traded, because some assets aren't, especially in industries like conservation and biodiversity. But where they are meant to be traded, we can actually derive the attributes, not just based on it being a static attribute, but the trust model that's behind them. So we know if there's a reversal on one of those attributes. We know if the data wasn't correct, or it's built on a scientific model or estimate that may have led to a downstream credit being created that we may want to actually revisit at a later date. And so we think this is a requirement for the industry. And the reason why we got to those principles, or the reason why we got to that mission, is because we're trying to address 5 key problems. One, we want to know and we want to understand this auditability problem in finance, because if we don't know where the money's coming from or where it's going to, we can't actually affect the change that we want to see. And if we don't see data and audit trails on that verification process or that validation process even prior to that, we're not going to know that those assets are being created with the funds that we're giving. And ultimately it leads to a problem where we have too many disparate systems for too many different parties that leads to estimates being used, and actually our prices aren't transparent because we don't have the right data that leads to better price discovery because the assets we know are real, and it ultimately leads to depressed market prices. Of course, in ESG reporting, if you're buying an asset, you don't have the data, it's going to be a lot harder to report. And so we're trying to address these problems. And we're trying to do that by setting goals around finance auditability, open sourcing methodologies, scaling validation and verification, not just bringing verifiers into the digital world, but bringing new verifiers into the local markets where they operate or where these projects are existing, so that we can create an asset that actually has local benefits, not just from an environmental sense, but from the other SDG senses as well. And thinking about, how do I enable financial transparency? How do I enable equitable finance to flow back to the communities in a restructured way that works for those economies? And ultimately, by creating these bioregionally supported assets, we also want to see an improvement of the price of the credits, and the flows of those increased prices go back to the communities, and actually proving that even in our ESG reporting applications, because companies can now see this. And so we've set these 5 goals for the fund that are backed up by the principles that support the mission. And so as we invest, we looked at the entire market life cycle, and we've looked at things like emissions reporting, how we invest in things like forwards and bonds, which have measurement and reporting requirements, and where we can even use things like carbon forwards to attach to green bonds, highlighting some of the great work that's been led by Masnaba Tioye, and ultimately is being implemented on platforms like Evercity for forward attached green bonds to enable auditable projects that are actually linked to the larger sustainable debt markets that are vastly larger than the carbon markets that exist, which are roughly a $2 billion market from last year. And these auditable projects, that especially in the voluntary carbon markets, are ultimately discovered and traded, ideally in a liquid way, where we can not just trade assets, but trade assets with context based on the digitized format, and ultimately enable those same assets that are traded to be reported with the audit trails intact. So those same assets, when they're traded, when they're retired, we use the same underlying information in an automated way, just like you would upload a document into something like TurboTax and get an automated output. That's where we want to get to. And we've mapped that to the market flow, and we built our investment thesis across this. And we've divided how we invest from emissions reporting into sustainable finance to auditable projects to data management and tooling beyond that, meaning I don't just know where the funding is coming from because we're digitizing it. I know where that goes into something like a carbon forward that funds a project. Maybe it's a nature-based solution or a biodiversity project, that I can actually see the rules, the roles, the actors who fulfill those roles, the data that they produce, because it's available on an Explorer where I can granularly see the information of the methodology and any type of data that comes from that is going to be verified on a public ledger. And ultimately, all those attestations can be viewed not just from a data audit trail perspective, but actually in evaluating the price for a trade. And we can include that into our trading and liquidity model to get better inferences and understandings of the value of one verifier versus another, someone who has expertise to improve the outcomes of the project versus someone who's maybe just learning. And ultimately understanding how we present that to customers who are enterprises who have large scale market demand, that they're actually using the same Guardian-based technology to understand the rules, the roles within those rule sets, the actors who fulfill those roles, and the data they produce for every single emissions token within a supply chain. So we can report both emissions tokens and any voluntary ecological market asset into a reporting framework whether it's a CDP framework or any other type of ESG reporting capability. And all this is underpinned by open source infrastructure that makes it easy to do these activities. And I think that's a really important, note for folks who are thinking about building. Do not try to build something if there's already an open source project, if you haven't tried that project first. If you say this doesn't answer my question, it's great to go build, but evaluate all the open source tools so you can build faster and get to climate outcomes quicker. Now, what this looks like on Hedera, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker, is we have the Guardian from a DMRV perspective, open source wallets, including verifiable credential wallets to make attestations, following those token standards that feed into our open source markets and marketplaces, including things like marketplaces for forwards, that exist out there in the ecosystem. For anyone who's interested, feel free to send me or anyone on my team a message. We can send you the GitHub repo for any of these projects, as well as send you the open source methodology library within the Guardian repo so you can get started quicker on taking the rule sets that we have today and improving them for your own use, or using them out of the box, or contributing a new artifact from a technology perspective. It looks like my screen's frozen. 1 second. There we go. Okay, so when we get into the Guardian, what we're ultimately getting to is attestation level information. On Hedera, we have 3 key services: our consensus service, our token service, and our smart contract service. Our smart contract service is EVM compatible. However, in the Guardian, we've actually found what's best fit is an identity-based workflow system with full audit trails that you can review and explore. And that really starts with how you're monitoring information. Ideally, we want to get down to a sensor-based level where it's very cheap and easy to report this information, coming as an attestation from somebody with something like a decentralized identifier. Now, something of note, decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials are compatible in many cases across chains. There's different standards set up by the W3C that enables resolving those credentials across different protocols. However, in the Guardian, we actually use this to chain these together. So decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials to be linked through every step of the methodology process to get to a verifiable outcome, to know that the data has not been manipulated at any point. But it ultimately starts with the sensor. Maybe it's a solar panel saying, I've transferred X amount of energy back to the grid and it's crossed a meter. It could be satellite data with signatures coming from a satellite. It could be any other type of information, even manually attested or collected as something like a soil core sample. And it's going through that measurable, reportable, and verifiable process into the Guardian, which is looking at it against a rule set that's known. Of course, from these rule sets, you could say, well, it could be terribly complicated. On the Guardian, we use JSON, which is not necessarily code, but actually shorthand for that. And we use JSON in a human readable format to try to link all this information together so you can actually see the rules that data is being processed against. And ultimately, at the end of those rules, we can actually verify the rules that you're following, as well as the data that's been applied against them and the approval process. What that looks like is from the point of that sensor or data generator information, that sensor has a DID key where it can issue a credential or an attestation about the step in the process. And they could even be certified to issue certain types of information. What that means is when that data is sent to Hedera, it's crossing our consensus service. You can think of it as a message queue or a publicly auditable log that you can look back and see the entire provenance of the history of the attestation where that sensor was given the right to emit data or certified to give data in the form of a credential. And that certifying authority, whether it's a validation and verification body or another actor within the project, has their own set of DIDs, and they can issue VCs for any part of the process or any data emitted, where they ultimately get that authority to do so in the form of a credential from a registry, which means it contains its own DID. Of course, that means you can build reputations for every single role and actor within the rules. You build your trust through a model where you can link back to where that root of trust is. Sometimes we call that a standard registry. In the past, it's been called a root authority, but that authority is where that trust is derived from. And ultimately, even in some cases, you may have folks who give credentials or reviews on that root authority, say it's VERA or gold standard, You could even give a review or an attestation of what you think about them because it's on a public ledger. Of course, people may dismiss that. People may say that's great because of your reputation within the industry, but it creates an open system for collaboration and review of assets, whether it's a policy and the rules, whether it's a specific actor or a sensor type, or it's manually attested data from a lab or data coming from a satellite, maybe even with an AI model over top of it, all of which can have reputations that live within this workflow. That means the workflow can be better understood, interpreted, and if you choose to trust it, you can trust any different part of it for your own asset, or you can look at a third-party asset and derive trust, which ultimately allows the asset to go to the market and receive some type of reputational review from a machine learning model to actually derive a price to say this asset should be trusted, it should have this value, because our machine learning model says the market values these attributes that those parties are involved in. In a nutshell, that's the high-level view of the Guardian. But what really makes the Guardian powerful is the ecosystem building on top of it, because you can think of it as a factory approach. Building one set of rules, may be relatively hard. Building 100 sets of rules is very hard. Building 100 methodologies is very hard to repeat it, so you can actually compare them to each other. And our ecosystem is building a very large methodology library. We believe it's the largest in the world today, of different types of MRV that exist, some of which come from, copies of the CDM or Vera or gold standard, and others come from new types of measurement technologies, whether it's Dovu's contributions in soil or other policies such as what Envision released, which is a clone of Vera's VM0017, which they did a webinar on last week. And they're actually going to be able to compare that coming up to a VM0042, which is the subsequent methodology and the improvement which Vera is moving to. So we'll be able to see the old versus the new in types of assets that can be created. But that doesn't just live in voluntary ecological markets assets. It also can go into emissions policies, biodiversity policies, or conservation policies, not just about the finance, but this is really focused on the data in measurement, reporting, and verification following a given standard or set of standards. What that may look like when you get down to a JSON level following the rules is you may have a set of rules that are very clearly the same as another set. But the cool thing about this is for the first time, you can actually compare and quantify the difference of one rule set to another. So if you look at these two rules, you can see some things that are similar and they have subgroups that are exactly the same, but you can also see where this group has one big difference right here. You have a new step in the application and you can actually quantifiably see the difference of what that looks like in a workflow. And you can point out each different field that's a difference, which means if you wanted to combine two methodologies, you could actually now quantify the difference of those two methodologies, whether you're looking at Vera or gold standard or CDM to another set of standards. And all of a sudden you can actually compare both the rules you're following and the answers that are followed on those rules. And what it gives you the ability to do is look at the percentage difference and decide if that's a material difference or not. And for the first time, you don't just have digitized rules that are scalable across methodologies, across projects, but you can actually compare them one-to-one in a quantifiable way and get to an answer set. If you want to make this a little more granular, I'm actually going to flip over to the emissions side of the market and you say, hey, well, how does this work in emissions tracking from a rule set? And you say, well, if I want to transparently show the sources of my emission roles and actors following a methodology, such as a product standard from the greenhouse gas protocol, I could trace down to a sensor level and understand how those emissions are going to be allocated to a product. And if I want to display that to every factory that I have, to every product that I have, I can go ahead and do that and pull data that's signed by each of my project stakeholders that regulators can see, that I can show my customers an improvement of reductions over time. And I can even show where the offsets come from in an equally granular way because they're all following this model, which is comparable to actually see changes over time, but also is comparable across peers in the industry because this is all on that public balance sheet, and that public balance sheet being Hedera. And so with that, I'll take a quick pause to take a step back and look at a higher view. So where does the Guardian fit within an ecosystem, right? So in the ecological markets workflow, you have what I call as our work in progress diagram. There's always folks being added to this. We try to simplify it to make it easy to understand. But you have a project that would start. And one of the applications in our ecosystem, some of the names you saw at the beginning, Dovu, Timeless, Cripsy, there's many others, would ultimately digitize a methodology. Of course, you could digitize a methodology as well and work with folks like validation and verification bodies For example, DNV is working with a company called EverCity, who is creating forwards and publishing methodologies for specific types of assets, which they announced at COP27, and they could be working with a registry. And so for some, one example is gold standard. And so if they were following a gold standard methodology with a VVB and a project, you could ultimately say, I want to lay that out digitally. And I want to use the Guardian to compare that to the previous methodologies where somebody can hold these assets, even in their forward stage, if you were to use EverCity in a forward, but ultimately when it's redeemed to create a token, once you've completed verification, that could be held in an account with a wallet on Hedera. We have many popular wallets on Hedera. We also have capabilities around, for folks who are curious around what types of wallets, happy to have that discussion, including things like MetaMask and how to use that on Hedera. But ultimately those assets are created, auditable down to the unit of value or metric ton. So often an NFT on Hedera following the IWA standards. So the Interwork Alliance, for those who aren't familiar, has created standards around voluntary ecological markets assets where the carbon removal unit is actually an NFT. And we can trade those assets, and we could even wrap them and create fungible versions of those assets if we wanted different types of liquidity. But folks like Toll are trading those assets in their unique units of value to trade based on the attributes rather than based on the commonalities, and still maintaining liquidity in the process. But you can see those assets on explorers on Hedera, and you can ultimately take them into ESG reporting applications. One we recently announced was CorpStage, who's building an ESG reporting application to understand carbon emissions tokens, as well as offsets for CDP-based reporting. And so that's kind of what it looks like in the ecosystem. I went very fast, but I'm always happy to take questions on this and get into a little bit further detail before I pass it over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Wes. Does anybody have any questions for Wes? I know it's a lot of information. One thing I'm curious about Wes. You've kind of captured a lot of the pain points, and you're actively working on them. What are some of the existing areas that nobody is tackling? That what are the areas that you see some of the greatest opportunities in this kind of in the ecosystem that you're building, and the kind of general ecosystem overall?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll go back to the ecosystem slide as we're talking about that. In our ecosystem, we see fantastic opportunities for what I call data exploration. Previously, a lot of this information that was out there was locked in PDFs, whether it's at the traditional registries or whether it was in specific project databases. And with the digitization of these processes and the opening of the data onto the public ledgers, there's this visualization opportunity. And one of the hardest things, not just within Web3, but in sustainability and climate action in general, is the hardest thing, in my view, is communicating visually what's happening out there in the real world and telling a compelling story that is tied to the data. I think we're very good at telling stories, but not necessarily tying stories to specific data points to show actionable outcomes. And so within our ecosystem, we're actively looking for folks who are able to take the data that is out there and visually communicate that. And that's something we're very excited about. We think there's also opportunities, though, on looking at those policy comparisons and telling the story that the academic community has been trying to tell in a way that is moving industry forward, but tied to real world projects, showing the improvement of where we were yesterday versus where we are today. And with new projects, with on the ground activities that previously couldn't necessarily be communicated in such a granular manner. And that's something I think it's going to change how the entire process around climate action works, and telling stories that are grounded in real world information.
Fantastic. Out of curiosity, a lot of the work seems to be focused on offsetting. You did mention kind of some insetting opportunities. Obviously, the application works just as well for that. The Guardian works just as well for that. Do you have any real world use cases that you can kind of talk about where Guardian's being used to kind of capture kind of emissions through a supply chain? How far along is that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very happy to talk about one of our governing council members on Hedera, Avery Dennison. So, and that's one of many use cases. I try not to get bogged down into too many specific ones, but Avery Dennison's one of the world's largest companies in both manufacturing because of their history in labeling. They're actually the world's largest RFID manufacturer. And they have a platform that they've started focused on digital birth certificates and identification called Atma.io. Atma.io, their goal is to give a soul to every product, and not just carbon emissions tracking, but all the different attributes around any product that has a label. And if you look in the back of your shirt for that red triangle logo, you may not know it, but that's Avery Dennison. And the idea of putting a digital trigger on that has every step along the way baked into it, that if you scan it with that QR code or read an NFC tag or an RFID tag, the ability to see the carbon footprint is a really cool opportunity to scale the carbon emissions tokens. And so they've actually talked about their implementation of the Guardian through some of their announcements, and the implementation of creating carbon emissions tokens at scale for some of those product lifecycle events for different scopes. And so we're excited about that one, but a very different one is Timeless out of Australia, who's working with the Queensland government and doing digital twins and on manufacturing processes. And so they're measuring things like carbon emissions tokens on energy usage for buildings with the Queensland government, but also looking at things like Magnum Mining, which is actually producing green pig iron to measure carbon emissions tracking following these open source methodologies. And so they're really, really exciting opportunities because you can actually go today and look at how some of those folks have built those methodologies out on the Guardian repo. And you can see exactly how they've accounted for it and suggest improvements if you think there needs to be improvements, but also use it for your own purposes in that process as well.
Thank you for that, Wes. Really interesting, and I will go look at that. I see, Bertrand, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I sure would. Thanks. And hi, Wes. Thanks for the presentation. I just had a quick question regarding one of the last points you made about tokenizing offset or emission reductions. And you mentioned using the issuing them as a non-fungible token. I just wanted to ask, what was the reason for issuing these a non-fungible token and actually raising a challenge? A non-fungible token by definition would be non-divisible, and you'd assume that here for issuing a batch of offsets, you'd want these to be divisible. So if you could speak to that and how you're conforming to the sort of NFT model.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's I'm going to take a quick step back and kind of give a lot of credit to the IWA for helping to bring these standards to bear for voluntary ecological markets, as well as carbon emissions tokens. For full disclosure, I helped lead the carbon emissions task force for the IWA, but have been a participant in the voluntary ecological markets task force since it launched a couple of years ago now, or maybe a year and a half ago. And as part of that, we came to the point of that same exact question. But we found that most registries do not issue fractional assets. However, some people decide to take those offsets and fractionalize them after the fact. And they only have issued wholes in terms of the metric ton count. And oftentimes that's also complemented by buffer pool models and things of that nature. We found that those assets needed to be part of a serialized class of assets, and those serialized classes had their own attributes. Of course, that could evolve over time, but that's the model that we've seen as adopted, and it makes it easier to track it in a similar way that you could track a good produced on a farm with unique attributes about it. Some of them may be similar, and some of them may be inherited as part of the class of assets, but many of the attributes could be different, whether it's a unit of time, a temporal pattern, or whether it's another asset that's from different parts of that ecological asset class based on location or sublocation of that project. So there's many different ways you could divide it, and we wanted to leave that opportunity open from a standards perspective. From our ecosystem perspective, our ecosystem has really leaned into that to build markets based on those attributes and creating new ways to actually build liquidity models that aren't fungible. But if you do want a liquidity model that's fungible, you can build a wrapper, what we call a reference token in the IWA. And that reference token can point back to the underlying ecological asset, but build a fungible layer on top of it as a tool. In the carbon emissions task force, It's a slightly different structure. It's fungible unique is the proposed standard, from a token perspective, and that's unique to a site and a scope as part of that nested reporting structure. And some of those elements are still being defined as part of that task force. And we're looking forward to getting feedback on those when we release the first version of the document, which is still being worked on.
Yeah. So if I were to understand correctly what you're just describing, you're using the NFT essentially as a reference point or an anchor for the issuing of say a given asset. So someone, company or organization issues an offset based on, ecological or say industrial reduction. And then that reference point can then be used for, some liquidity model, which may include fractionalizing the sort of quantities embedded in that.
Correct. Yeah, you can think of it as a building block. Most traditional exchanges will build baskets, and those baskets will come from many different classes, but it's hard to trace back to the specific unit because it's a lot of times it's a paper-based system. In this way, you have a data package linked to every single asset. And that way, if there's something like a reversal, you can figure out which assets are affected or not affected as well. And it gives provenance to that specific asset versus trying to divide it after the fact, which may be harder.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks. Look forward to reading more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the version 2 of that, the voluntary ecological market white paper from the IWA is out and available for those who are interested. So.
Great. I don't see any other questions. Thank you, Wes.
Thank you.
All right, let me go ahead and share my screen.
Should be at the very bottom, very center. Do you see it?
Oh no, I know how to share the screen on Zoom. I'm just don't know how to share the screen on Google Slides. Got it. Okay, 1 second. It's just going to start from the beginning. So let me just fast forward to the slide.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, Wes. Thank you, Sherwood. And thank you also to the SIG for hosting us. I'm trying to hit the resume share. Is it sharing or not?
It says Daniel Norkin has started screen sharing. There we go. Yep, seeing it.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. So, thanks again. We're really honored over here to go ahead and present this. I actually didn't know that the first presentation was during the launch, so it's not yet Throwback Thursday, but Throwback Tuesday over here. So it's good because I actually have a slide here that talks about the progression that we had since the time that we launched it up until now, and some of the development milestones. So I think it'll be great for everyone to see it. For those that came in a little bit later, I just wanted to say hi. My name is Dan Norkin. I'm one of the co-founders here at Envision Blockchain. And for this presentation, for this side, so Wes was talking about the entire ecosystem and how the whole ecosystem is contributing to building sustainable markets on Hedera. There was some focus there on the Guardian and some of the questions too in the chat about the Guardian. Let me just give a brief overview about the Guardian so that we can kind of set the stage before I give any sorts of demos. Essentially, the Guardian, it's a solution that's built on top of the Hedera public ledger that's used to mint emission tokens, carbon offset tokens, renewable energy credit tokens. We call them digital environmental assets also. And again, it produces these auditable, traceable, and reproducible records, and it documents the entire life cycle of these assets that I was just talking about, which really aim to reduce the fraud in the ESG market, on top of other things as well. So if you could just take a look at the screenshot that we have there on the right side, and we're actually going to show you a live version of this. This is the picture of the trust chain. And I think that the trust chain is one of the most novel ideas that came from the Guardian, because there needs to be a way to move away from the traditional methods of just having these paper certificates that are in traditional systems right now, where for sure you can go ahead and request an audit, but then you're just stacked with more paper and more difficulties and rigor and manual processes in order to go ahead and find how a certificate was issued, how an offset was issued, how carbon claims were made. And this is the trust chain that has something that we call a verifiable presentation, which is a collection of more than one verifiable credentials. And we have a pretty neat way of displaying it so that you can actually see as you go through your methodology, like Wes was talking about, that we have a whole open source methodology library that you can go and pick, or you can go and add your own. As you hit certain steps and certain workflows, we issue verifiable credentials. This trust chain links everything together for you to open it up and actually see. And since this is on a public ledger, you can actually go and see everything that's happening. So again, just kind of diving into that concept just a little bit deeper, we understand that the process of collecting and supporting these carbon claims, it's manual, it's prone to error, there's data quality issues, there's lack of assurance, we have greenwashing in the news, double counting is a big issue, just an overall lack of trust. And this is where we've introduced this concept of a policy workflow engine that you see there in the right-hand screen, on the right-hand side. And this policy workflow engine, it allows users, typically policy creators, if you will, or really anyone that wants to go ahead and mirror a standard body, like a methodology from a standards regulation or a regulatory body. They can go ahead and do that via these workflow blocks. It kind of looks like a BPM tool. And the best way to look at it is to kind of think of it like, the policy that you see right there on the right side. It's a coded instance of a methodology. So whether it's a gold standard methodology, whether it's a Vera methodology, CDM, or any of the GHGs as well, you can think of these little rectangles like Legos in order to design the desired workflow of what you want. We're going to show you how that looks like in the demo, but again, you can literally create them on the fly. And what's interesting about this is that everything that you can do in the Guardian application, you could do in your application, because it's really an API product. So while we have a front end for the users to use, you can still do it through your front ends, through your applications, just connecting via the APIs that are provided. So this was the slide that I was talking about. So again, just kind of, Throwback Tuesday over here, is that here's a little bit of the release history. So obviously when we first released version 1.0.0 beta.1, you can fast forward that we're all the way up to version 2.10 right now. We included a front end. It was very basic. There was a backend service. There were some token functions and storage. There was a message broker that kind of tied everything together. There was a policy workflow engine that allowed for the creation of methodologies. But then over the course of time, we added API stability, different versioning, importing of policies, the ability to publish them, the ability to have decentralization, improved documentation. Further along the later releases, we added support for complex policy workflows, because these methodologies, they're not simple by any means. You're basically taking 300 pages of technical instructions and you're trying to codify it, which is a fairly cumbersome task. providing different features like aggregation blocks, allows for the kind of mimicking that we're talking about, revocation, which Wes was talking about. Once a VC is issued, how can you take it away if there's errors, if there's issues? VPs, event-driven token policies, automation of token operations, dry run, which is a cool one. I'm going to show you dry run in the demo. Multi-user roles, multi-sig approvals. And if you fast forward to where we are today, which is the most recent launch of 2.10, which was just last week, we added support for retirement of tokens, multi-policy tokens, disaster recovery policy modules, and selective disclosure, which there is a blog that was just posted on the Hedera website. Selective disclosure brings ZKP to the Guardian so that if there's some information that needs to be held confidential, but not all information, we now have the ability to do that. So just kind of a glance into the future, where do we see the Guardian going in the future? I think that from my perspective, we would like to make it a lot easier for policy creators to go in, access the Guardian, and be able to build methodologies, like in a matter of minutes. It definitely takes some time. It takes a mixture of having a sustainability background together with a development background. It's kind of hard to do one without the other, but we're constantly looking at ways of advancing that with policy modules that you're going to see that was just introduced. So you're going to have the ability to import already created policy modules. Again, the best part about having everything that we're doing open source is that you can actually look into this open source library, pick from it, and that kind of accelerates your speed to market because you don't have to rebuild something. I know that Wes was saying this early in a presentation. It's like, why would you build something that's already built and is open source so that you can continuously improve it, give it back to the community, and it kind of like that's like the cycle that just goes around. So again, there's two versions of the Guardian available. Of course, the open source Guardian, which is what we talked about. It's available to fork and use immediately. Go to github.com/hashgraph/Guardian. Everything's right there. We do have from Envision blockchain as the builders and maintainers of the Guardian. We realize that not every customer or user wants to go ahead and work from the open source Guardian. They may not want to manage all the different components that the Guardian has. And it's important to be able to scale it when you're in a production environment as well. So that's what we offer is a managed Guardian service. It's the hosted environment. We provide you with the resources and the tools and the support. Once you sign up with us, again, you have two ways to get started. You have all the APIs. You also have a front end. And you get all the SaaS benefits as well, such as multi-tenancy. You have 99.9% uptime SLAs. And obviously that we have the Kubernetes backed solution so that, as the infrastructure and the workload of our customers increases, we have all this auto scaling to be able to support the consumption. So what we're going to do right now for the remainder of the time, and I know that I have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, is we're going to provide a demo of how the Guardian digitizes methodologies. And this is kind of like a really big one in the news right now. Basically, I'm stealing some of the slides from the previous webinar, but we recommend that if you're on the Guardian, you have a policy development checklist. You want to be able to find out what type of credit you're looking for, VCUs, VERs, RECs, etc. Then you need to go ahead and find the appropriate standard body, whether it be Vera or Gold Standard or CDM. Then you want to look through the methodologies within the standard body to find the one that fits best for the project. Is it forestry? Is it agriculture? So on and so forth. Then from that point, it gets a little technical. That's when you're going to want to start working on schemas, which is really the data model of the methodologies, and to be able to put all of these final calculations of the credits into some tool that allows you to then translate it into the Guardian. So I'll show you what we do. And then, of course, after that, you want to create your workflow, which is the policy workflow. This is essentially the set of technical requirements. First, then last, who does what and what time and what's the rules behind it. And then you want to go ahead and build the policy and deploy it. So the one that we're going to show a demo on is the Vera VM0017, which estimates and monitors the greenhouse gas emissions of project activities that reduce emissions in agriculture through adoption of sustainable land management practices in agricultural landscape. I will put a very funny notice that once we began to work on this webinar in Vera VM0017, literally a week before the webinar, Vera put out a notification saying that it is scheduled to be deactivated. So don't look too hard into this one to reuse it. But actually what we plan on doing is, if you subscribe to the newsletter or to the YouTube channel that we have there, or just reach out to us the next month. So this month, we're going to be doing Vera VM0042. And we're going to use the policy differentiation tool that Wes was talking about to compare the differences between 17 and 42. So you'll be able to see the differences, not just at the business workflow rules level, but actually at the data structure and the schema level as well. And we're very excited about that one. So again, this is just an example of a schema. You have here, required fields, schema types, whether they're strings or addresses, or they're integers or email addresses, and date ranges. So for example, most likely there's going to be forms to fill out, registrations to fill out. This is what we mean by schemas. If you go further down to the different requirements, you're going to have to take an accounting of the total baseline emissions and removals, and so on and so forth. And then what happens is, once you have your schemas, you have your data structures, now you want to lay out the workflow. So the blue rectangles are the project proponents. The orange rectangle is Vera itself, or the standard body. And the green is the VVBs, or the verifiers. So essentially the workflow that we have here that you can mimic in the Guardian is that you have these different roles and different actors. I know there was a question in the chat about it, that perform certain actions that need approvals or need actions from other actors to happen. And once everything happens in accordance with the workflow and the policy rules, at the very end, you see the last block where Vera issues the tokens, the VCUs, an account, records, and registry. And again, I just want to put it out there that we're not acting as Vera by any means. We're just demonstrating how you can take a methodology and make it digital. So with that in mind, let me just stop sharing, and I'll share my screen right now. Here we go. Okay, so now you should be able to see the Managed Guardian service that we have here. So again, we're showing this to you through the Managed Guardian service, not the open source, but again, the layout and functionality is identical. So we have these tabs along the top, and here we're in the policy screen, and you can see that we imported two different policies. Again, so we have the remote work GHG policy. This is a policy that supports the estimation, calculation, tokenization of GHG emissions resulting from remote work. Then we also have the Vera VM0017, which is the one that we were just discussing. Again, we wanted to showcase this to show the flexibility that it's not just on one side of the markets, it's also on both sides of the markets. And importing policies are very simple. You can either import them from files, you can import them from IPFS, or you can import them through our preloaded policy picker that we have here that's connected to the methodology library that's an open source. To show you around a little bit, so we have schemas, and schemas again, so remember that Excel sheet that I was sharing with you? So you have the ability to create them right within the Guardian. So you can create your schemas. And if I were to, for example, open one up, I'm just going to pick a random one, project estimates of soil organic carbon. You could see you can name your fields, you can give the fields a type, none, if it's number, integer, string, Boolean, etc. And again, you have the different schemas for different policies. We have the different tokens. Okay, so again, because everything is on a public ledger, we can go ahead, click on any of these token IDs. You can see that these tokens are created. For example, the VCU is a non-fungible token, like what we were talking about before. Contracts is where we would create the retirement contracts. We just didn't do it for purposes of the demo. Artifacts, this one is specific to the GHG policy because there's certain mapping, for example, country emission factors or region emission factors that need to be put into account. And then we'll get into the policies. And when we have our policy, the best way I could describe the workflow is to actually show it to you. So again, I'll just go to this screen right here. And here's the high level workflow with the different colors and rectangles. So when it's in the Guardian, you can see that this is the technical instructions of how this policy looks like from a workflow perspective. And just to show you how some of these things work, I'm just going to run really quickly through this, through the Vera policy. Again, this is in dry run mode, so nothing is put on chain. Everything is actually put in memory so that this is a good way to test policies out. We know that there's 3 users here. We have the blue, the orange, and the green. So I'm going to go ahead and create 2 more users. For user 1, I'm going to give this one the project proponent role. For user 2, I'm going to give this the VVB role. I'm going to give it a title, VVB. Waiting for approval. See, this is some of the workflow steps. So I'm going to go back to the standard registry, who's the administrator right now. I'm going to go ahead and approve it. The next step in this workflow is for the project proponent to submit their project. And again, just for purposes of this, I'm just going to put in some really random data here. I put in a map, put in a date, monitoring period. And I know I'm just at the top of the hour, so if you can just stick with me, we can get through this pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's all. We have the room for another 30 minutes, and we bleed over sometimes in these presentations, so that's okay.
Cool. So I'm just going through. Obviously, when you do this, you're going to do this the right way. I'm just doing this for demo purposes and going through. You definitely don't want to be with me while I fill out every one of these form fields. Okay, so
that's what part of your managed service is, that you go through the entire process and process it for people. Is that part of it?
Yeah, we could do that too.
Yeah.
No, I'm completely joking. So this would come from the project proponent, right? So this would be the information that's specific to the form that they need to fill out in order to register their project with Vera.
Right.
Okay. So once that was filled out, just to show you, so you see now here's the verifiable credentials that was just created with all my fictitious data. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the VVB. The VVB then, sorry, let's go back to the standard registry. Standard registry has to now, they're going to view the project. They're going to add it. At that point, the project proponent will assign the VVB to the approved VVB list. Then the VVB then will need to validate the project. Again, they can go ahead and take a look at the VC. We'll validate it. We'll then go back to the project proponent. We'll add the monitoring report. See, it's all taken in through IPFS. Through web3.storage, actually, the Filecoin green it's what's integrated right now. We go back to the VVB. See, they got the monitoring report. They can view it. You can verify it. And then, of course, the last step is for Vera to go ahead and take a look at it. They can take a look at the VC as well, and they can go ahead and mint it. And again, I just went through this like really, really fast, but this is essentially the entire workflow that VM17 is all about. So now that it's minted, I just wanted to do all of this just to show the trust chain. So we can go to token history, and now we view the trust chain. And here's the beauty about the trust chain, is that from here, you can see every single step that happened and who did what. So this is, again, remember that we're in the dry run, so nothing's on chain over here. You would have the real users if you published it and not done on the dry run mode, but you would be able to see, you know, the standard registry created the policy. They created their account. The project proponent created the project. You can actually go ahead and open it up and see the metadata. And this is where selective disclosure would be important, because not everything needs to be in the public domain. This is where ZKP really, really helps provide the confidentiality. However, you still need to be able to see that these things happened, these actions happened, and by who and at what specific time. You know, the project validation, monitoring report, so on and so forth, all the way through the minting of the VCUs. So that is really the power in the trust chain and what it stands for, and why we think that all these tokens that are created via Guardian will be able to, you know, have the good foundation in order to create these sustainable markets that Wes was talking about. So that essentially is the end of the demo and the intro about the Guardian. So I know that we're at time, but I'm more than happy to stay for a couple more minutes and answer any questions.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure they're pretty. Thank you for that really great presentation. Really, just, you know, just a robust solution. And you guys have thought through a lot, and it's just really well designed. And really appreciate you taking the time to walk through it. I'll start. I've got some in the meeting chat, but while I read those, I'll say, Bertrand, I see your hand raised. And then I'll just kind of go to some of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up question. You just mentioned the role of ZKPs or knowledge proofs in sort of managing access to some of the metadata you were showing. Does the Guardian service provide support for any ZKP like systems like garbled circuits or something like that?
So right now, it was just released yesterday, actually. That includes BBS signatures is the current
Sorry, can you repeat that? I missed it.
BBS.
Oh,
BBS
okay.
signatures.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going through the open source right now, trying to deploy it on my machine. So I may be following up with you offline later this week or next
feel
week.
free to reach out, and we're more than happy to help you through it all.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is Jeff Roche. I had a question for Daniel. He's still taking questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have one question. What's the responsibility from a data flow standpoint of the entity doing the project or generating either emissions or credits? In other words, what's a good example? Let's say I have a methane emissions that I'm trying to burn. Do I have to, outside of MGS, get the flow rates, get the composition of the gas, compute the amount of carbon being emitted, or can I send those directly to your system and then you compute whatever carbon calculation standard you have or using in place of my doing it myself. So essentially, what's the responsibility that, yeah, I don't know if that's clear or not, but what's the responsibility essentially
No,
of the
it's
user
clear.
to send data in? Oh, okay.
Sure. No, it's clear, and that's a really good question. So there's a couple of things that MGS is. Well, let me just say Guardian, because it's all one and the same if it's open source or if it's MGS. There's certain things that Guardian is and certain things Guardian is not. The Guardian is not an MRV solution. Okay, think of us like an API product. So here, for example, let me just put this out here. And again, 99% of everything that you see here is the same as open source, just a little bit different with APIs that relate to tenants and things like that, but it's all about the same. So think of us like an API product. All right. So you will still need the need for an MRV application. Granted, we do provide a front end like what you see here, but most would want to provide their own branding. They might want to provide their own look and feel, as well as all the extra features that we just don't put in here that other MRV solutions will, which is kind of like what you're talking about. So, if you have IoT sensors that are sending information, you don't need to worry about the calculation, because the calculation is actually all built within the schema. So we have we have the tools to be able to take in certain information and provide calculation via I don't know if you could see it here. Yeah, so there's certain policy workflow blocks that allow you to calculate, as long as you have the right schema values, the right data values coming into the Guardian. We can handle the calculation via policy.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Just one thing that may be helpful to add there is, if you're able to do the calculation based on a public set of rules, if you aren't deriving the calculation through some proprietary method, or even if you are, it gives some transparency to how you got there. So if you're using something like an emission factor or some type of metric that has been scientifically derived, but say that updates or changes, the benefit of putting it on a public ledger is we can identify every element of the set of rules across the entire ecosystem. Meaning all the rules are in public. You can identify all the parts of the rules that may have systemic failures that's not the role of the publisher, right? To do the scientific and academic verification of that element. Their job should really just be to create the digital workflow that creates auditability. And then if we have the systems to identify those gaps in the rules, say, for example, we look at the Higg index. The Higg index made certain assumptions that proved not to be what everyone else thought they would be. And by folks making buying and purchasing decisions off of the Higg index, people's expectations weren't met. And that led to a systemic risk of how people behaved because they thought it was driving an outcome. The same thing could be said amongst any methodology across any of the registries, how they're using implementations. And if we bring those out in public, we get rid of some of those systemic risks in the sense of not being able to find them and correct them. Of course, we're going to have to do things and maybe make adjustments, but those adjustments all become a lot easier once it's on the public ledger.
That makes sense. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Dr. James, I see your hand raised. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, apologies, colleagues. I was in another meeting prior to this. Just two questions. You state that you're not a digital MRV. Is that correct?
Correct. So the Guardian and what you're seeing over here, Managed Guardian Service, is just a tool set that that the standard bodies or the standard registries or issuers can use.
Right. And this, so if you already have that, just for clarity, if you already have your own MRV, this then becomes a bolt-on for tokenization. Is that what you're saying? Via API and via some sort of API integration?
I think you cut out, but I think you're saying that if you have your own methodology, can you create that in here?
No, if you already have your own MRV, right? You could use your API in order to tokenize whatever credits you want to produce. Is that what you're saying?
So I think I understand you correctly, but let me try to reiterate it. If you have your own methodology, okay, you would want to be able to translate that methodology into a Guardian policy.
Right.
Because that way, as you follow through your methodology workflow and all the rules that are part of your methodology, you then get to the token minting event. If you mint the token without all of the previous information, you kind of lose the benefits of running everything through the policy workflow engine to create the trust chain.
Okay.
So I think what you're saying is that you have a methodology. Can you just create the token? And I would say that you would be better off if you were to bring that methodology into the Guardian format.
Right. What if I'm trying to tokenize someone's estate? Okay, they have created a process by which they are converting waste into new products and services without producing any further emissions. How could I then bring that sensitive data, right?
I think
into
that,
UST,
yeah.
Issues of data compromise and challenges around that.
So I think that the way that you would go about it is the same way that we discussed, for example, to go about digitizing the Vera methodology, where you want to be able to create your schemas, which is the data structure of what you're talking about, and to be able to design the workflow, who does what, at what time, by what approval, using what schemas. And then again, translating these schema attributes into the Guardian. Again, you can create them this way by creating your fields and the field types. And then you go and you create your policy, just like we created our policy, but now you would incorporate all of these workflow actions, referring back to the schemas that you created.
Okay, so you're not providing any sort of assurance that the original data is fit for purpose. All you're just doing is just the mechanism by which you convert that emissions data into some tokenized product. That's
You're
basically
asking, yeah, you're asking essentially I know the blockchain hasn't been around for that long, but you're asking essentially the blockchain age-old question: how can we make sure that the data going in is accurate, right?
Well, that's also the reputation component
Exactly.
that Wes mentioned.
Exactly. So there's those components, but I would say again, what's the most important thing about the Guardian is the verification that when the workflow actions are approved, you have accountability for the actor that approved that, right? So
right. I got you.
you know what I'm saying?
Okay,
Because we're using DIDs and VCs. Let me see if this is still here or if it reset. Yeah, good. So I think we still have this here. So for example, the VVB in this example The VVB in this example, when they approved my nonsense of 111111111, they're going to be the ones held accountable for it. And this is what we mean to provide auditable records, because let's be honest, we all can't sit here with a straight face and say that we can prove that the data coming in is always going to be accurate, like garbage in, garbage out. That's just what it is. We know that the data coming in is going to be immutable. That's all good. But now we have a way that we can prove and have accountability for the verifiers or who approved what, because literally everyone is signing these transactions.
Just one thing to add on, because it's an identity-based workflow system, those identities are portable. So if you have a verifier who's working on this trust chain, they may also be a verifier who's working on another trust chain on a completely different process. And you can see those reputations built over time. So for example, if you're doing an emissions assessment on a specific project, or you're doing assurance to make sure that somebody's accounted properly, even though it may be a different process than what somebody else is doing, you can look at that reputation over time, see the credentials that they've received. Maybe you could even look to the processes that they're tied to, right? The whole project, and see if those projects have had reversals. Is it tied to the data that they've approved? And you can start to understand and develop the trustless, kind of trustless viewpoint of, well, I don't have to trust somebody else saying that they're good. I can see it myself. I can actually prove that this meets my standards because all the attributes they're tied to and all the credentials they're tied to within the process that they were working in are good. And the data that they've approved is good. If it doesn't meet your standards, though, you can say, hey, I don't want to work with that group because the data that they're approving doesn't meet my standards, or maybe the project that they decided to work with didn't meet my standards. And that's okay. And you can work with other folks who maintain these identities and credentials, or you could even onboard net new parties who have those credentials, if that makes sense.
Right. Killer question. What is the benefits of using this platform as opposed to Fabric?
So from a architectural perspective, the Guardian is very different than Fabric. So I actually used to work at Oracle, which was a big Hyperledger, still is a big Hyperledger Fabric proponent. And then one of the big reasons I ended up joining Hedera back in 2019 was because of the need to keep some of these assets on a public ledger, specifically things like emissions and offsets. And the reason why we say, and the reason why our mission is bringing the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger, is you shouldn't be able to get rid of the history of your emissions or the balance of your ecological activities by turning off your cloud subscription, by turning off your local server in that permissioned or private network. That's our viewpoint. We think it should be fully auditable and information discoverable, and that entire provenance of information and the immutability should withstand the test of time, and not just how long you can afford to pay for the history of those assets. That being said, of course, if the history of the assets go away and you have the storage, you may have some of that from Fabric, but at the same time, you get the trust imbued from the public network that's governed. And we didn't really talk about governance of Hedera today, but it's governed by Fortune 500s and blue chip companies within their industry across not just a single industry, but their geographies. You have companies like Google, Tata, IBM, DLA Piper, Standard Bank, and all these organizations have signed up and said, I'm going to run a node of this network. I'm going to participate in technical governance. I'm going to participate in membership and bringing on new members who have use cases and improve corporate utilization, because these types of use cases actually change how their companies work. And the very cool thing is, with the Coin Economics Committee of working on the public network of Hedera, they've actually put the money where the mouth is, and they said, I'm going to invest in ecosystem development. And as part of launching the Sustainable Impact Fund, we're actually the first network to launch a major sustainability fund, because all of these companies actually have robust ESG and sustainability goals, and they want to invest in this area that they view as collaborative. They view bringing the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger as a collaborative opportunity rather than a competitive one, right? Accounting for emissions, meeting net zero goals, and proving that in the public domain is something they're all very interested in and have invested in along those lines. So yeah.
All right. So it's the current question of whether to be public or to be private in terms of emissions data, because one day this is going to be taxed. So one day, and I think some companies have been are very reticent in putting that data out in the public because it will be called up at some point in time. So personally, I'm yet to make a decision which way to go, right? Because it's not been asked for as yet by the average business. We're not talking the leaders here, you know, because we're talking here just, let's say, for example, a construction company down the road, they produce tons of emissions, but they're not asking for that. They're just asking for a basic report. But in the long run, I believe that just something like this will become common. And as Sherwood will attest, I'm very much out there sense checking and trying to understand exactly which direction to head. So feel free to put links in the chat so that I could have a closer look at it. So if you can, that's me signing off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I shared a link of Timeless, who's working with a mining company, just to give a constructive example in those physical industries. What I would say is there's also something that we don't talk about by putting it on a public ledger, which is this automation opportunity. If you have the map of the methodologies, you have the map of the project data, when you're going to do reporting to, say, CDP or GRI, IFRS, any of the big reporting entities, that process of collecting data is very hard. It's time burdensome. By putting this all in the public ledger, by following standards, which our ecosystem is mapping out, you actually can automate the collection of that data and save companies time and money. So the ironic thing is, even though this is a compliance effort, by using public ledgers, it actually can save folks money by collecting information and saving them time so they can focus on more productive climate activities. And that's one of the benefits we don't talk about enough on using full and robust DMRV across different processes, whether it's in purchasing offsets or that are linked to that DMRV, not just fungible and not traceable to that point, or taking processes like carbon emissions, where we're protecting the private information, keeping it private using selective disclosure and ZK, but also mapping that to the proper carbon emissions accounting and other types of SDG related accounting. So
Fantastic.
Cheers.
Well,
Very much.
I'm sorry.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
absolutely.
But I really appreciate all you guys taking out another 24 minutes of your day. This is really, really valuable. And we actually have a large number of participants still on the call, so there's a lot of interest in this. Thank you, Wes, and thank you, Daniel. We'll be posting a recording of this to YouTube as well. For everybody like me that feels like you're going to have to watch this a second time to fully download everything that was shared. Again, Wes, Daniel, thank you from us all. We really appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. And for folks who want to get more involved, if you're looking, how can I use this? How can I get a funded opportunity? Please check out the hackathon we're doing right now on methodologies for SBS Boston. We have $17,500 of prizes just around Guardian methodologies and tooling, in addition to the other prizes. I think the total hackathon pool of funding is over $40,000 right now. So if you want to say, hey, how can I use this? Please check that out. I think it's really exciting for folks to get involved. And I just want to say thank you all again for having us. It's been great to be here, and we look forward to coming back in the future and participating in the calls going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.